So my name is Whitney Cloyne. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, primarily work with survivors of sexual assault and sexual exploitation, which is why I have studied a lot about neurobiology of trauma, and I'm really glad to be able to present here twice a year on this topic. I myself, as a baby social worker, did this Core 40 training many years ago in person in Indianapolis. And so it's been an honor the last few years to be asked back to present. I'll be with you guys today for this one, and then I'll be back on Thursday to talk about vicarious trauma and burnout and self-care. So today, I'm obviously not a neuroscientist, so we're not going to get too deep into the brain. It's super complex, but we're going to talk about a few parts of the brain and how our brains react when we're experiencing trauma. And yeah, there we go. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the nervous system, and specifically, we will talk some about how memory is impacted by trauma, because that can be really important in your work as advocates. So, for this presentation, I use the triune brain because these are like the three main parts of the brain that are impacted by trauma. And so, obviously, from the picture on the slide before and from science class growing up, we know that our brains are very complex and have a lot of different parts, but we're mostly going to focus on the brainstem, which obviously connects our brain to the rest of our body and to our nervous system, and completes all those functions of self-preservation. Then we'll talk a little bit about the limbic system, which is the area of our brain where emotions and memory happen, and then our prefrontal cortex, which facilitates our higher level of thinking. And so I actually want to work backwards. And so first we will talk about the prefrontal cortex. This part of our brain is the last part to fully develop. It does not develop until mid to late 20s. And so, when we're dealing with kids and with teenagers, we're not dealing with fully developed prefrontal cortices. And so that's why problem solving and a lot of like decision making starts to get stronger in our 20s. This part of the brain does not turn on when you're experiencing trauma. And so if you're thinking about it, the system, how we're going to starting here, going down to the brainstem, and then the brainstem connecting to the rest of the body. When we're experiencing trauma, a lot of that information is like only making it into the limbic system. And so when someone's experiencing trauma, their prefrontal cortex is not online. And so it's really hard to actually make clear, developed decisions when you are experiencing a trauma, or if you are experiencing a trauma response. So even if you're not currently experiencing trauma, but your body and your nervous system is re-experiencing trauma, that prefrontal cortex is still not going to be like lit up as much as other parts of the brain. And we'll talk a little bit more about neuroplasticity later, but thanks to neuroplasticity, our brains do continue to change and grow after this point. And so even once our brain is fully developed, that doesn't mean that we aren't able to make changes. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how neuroplasticity works and like going to therapy and other things, how that helps to change ways of thinking and heal from trauma. So next is our limbic system. This area of the brain assigns meaning to emotions, and it coordinates with brainstem to assess for danger. And so all of us, our brainstem and our amygdala, are constantly kind of scanning for safety. And so like even as I'm sitting here with you, my brain in the background is scanning to make sure that my environment is safe. Like if my dog started barking, then like my brain is going to be like, oh, wait, maybe we're not safe. But right now, since we're safe and I have experienced not a lot of big T trauma in my life, I don't notice that scanning happening. But for those who have experienced trauma, oftentimes that scanning turns into what's called hypervigilance. And so they are more aware of that constant scanning. And so it's harder for them to engage their prefrontal cortex, be more engaged in life, because that part of their brain, they're using a lot of their energy to actually think about that function. Whereas if you haven't experienced a lot of trauma, like for all of us, we're all sitting here watching this presentation, but our brain and our body is still scanning our environment for safety. So the amygdala is the center for emotions, emotional behavior, emotional memory. The amygdala is a big part of trauma response and trauma, the way that your brain files memories when you're experiencing trauma. And so that's why sometimes when you have experienced trauma, when that comes back up for you later, it feels really emotional. You feel it in your body, but you don't always have clear of exactly what happened or what you experienced, or you're not able to make chronological memories of that, which we'll talk more about memory later. And that's because the amygdala has filed that away, but the amygdala is really more about that emotion and the behavior. And then our hippocampus is important for that center for long-term memory, where we're able to remember more details, not just the emotions, but also what we were thinking. And that part doesn't quite come online sometimes when we're experiencing trauma. Then, of course, the brainstem regulates our body's automatic functions essential for life: breathing, heartbeat, blood pressure, swallowing, all the things that our body needs to live. Our brainstem does that, but it also is what connects the brain to the rest of our body. And so it uses all of our senses to scan for safety and connects that information back to the brain. It connects the information that our bodies provide back to the brain. And then our brain also, of course, gives information to our bodies. And so our nervous systems and our body functions are super connected to what we're thinking, feeling, and experiencing. And our brainstem is what makes that all happen. So, next, we will talk a little bit about survival mode. And so the 4 F's are what people primarily think of when we think about our trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. They are exactly what they sound like when someone is experiencing trauma. Also, sometimes when you're experiencing a trauma response, but first we'll talk about when someone is experiencing a sexual assault or an attack, or they're in the middle of a domestic violence incident. That these are kind of the brain's options when that prefrontal cortex isn't online, and your body and your prefrontal cortex is not making the decision of what you should do. Your brain is working for survival. Our brains are primarily wired for surviving, not for thriving. It takes, work and higher level thinking. And so when we live in a world that is safe, we have access to that feeling of safety and that feeling of thriving. But when we're living in a survival mode, our brain is really working off of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So fight is going to be literally fighting back, but also just that trauma response of like, okay, what can I do? Flight is going to be run. Freeze is going to be like a complete shutdown. We'll talk about a couple different types of dissociation and shutdown on some other slides. And then fawn is kind of that people pleasing. There is a little bit more of that higher level thinking, just where the brain is like, okay, what can I do to like limit the harm that I'm going to experience? And so there's a documentary that I've watched many times that is a really good explanation of the fawn response. Is there was a older woman who lived alone, and a man broke into her home and sexually assaulted her, and she was able to report later that she literally remembered thinking like, I could fight back, but like he's bigger than me, he's stronger than me, he could hurt me, and so I'm just going to lay here. And so that's an example of the fawn response, where she was like, this is terrible, but there could be more pain on the other side. And then obviously fawn response and survival mode moving into life after trauma response can go into a lot of people pleasing, and it also creates vulnerability for being in unhealthy relationships again in the future, because that kind of becomes an automatic response for the brain when it's experiencing stress or trauma. So these are just some more detailed examples of hyper versus hypoarousal of the nervous system when someone is experiencing trauma or experiencing a trauma response. And so these on the left are going to be those kind of fight flight. This is more what is really being experienced in the body. So there's a lot of adrenaline in the body. So obviously feeling overwhelmed, heart rate increasing, obviously, just like even if you can't, having that urge in your body to flee, to move away or toward the event. Anger, this fight or flight is really like an out of control kind of feeling because you really can't control it. Like your brain is just doing what it needs to do. And so it can also create feelings of being scared or anxious, and the need to over accommodate or people please is fawn. Someone asked how long these states can last. That's a really great question. It really varies. And as far as like if it's more of a trauma response and not like active trauma, I mean, sometimes people like live in hyperarousal or hypoarousal if they have experienced a lot of trauma or they're experiencing like cumulative trauma over time. I would say for like a more severe freeze state, if someone is like experiencing a trauma and they're going into a freeze state, um, I actually can't even really say for sure how long it can last, but usually when it's more of that like immobility kind of freeze and shut down, someone is, usually going to like come out of that more when it's been right after the trauma that they have experienced. I'm sorry I can't give a more clear answer. That's something that I should really work on and add. That's a really great question. And as we talk more, I think some of the like living more in the trauma response, we do talk about that more at the end because we're going to talk about like polyvagal theory and the nervous system more. And so we will talk a little bit more about that. And someone asked like the fawn response, where is that more seen? And someone did say kind of more long term. And yes, fawn is definitely a lot more long term. I have a lot of clients that have experienced when they're like in a sexual exploitation kind of situation. So they're going to do a lot of fawning with their trafficker where they're like not really agreeing with the perpetrator, but they're doing things to please them, to keep themselves safe or keep other people safe. And so it can happen, obviously, like the one example I gave, like it does happen with like single incident sexual assault as well, but fawn is definitely more of a response where someone who's in domestic violence, sexual exploitation or trafficking, where they have kind of learned the ways to accommodate that person to keep themselves either physically safe or to get different or better treatment. And so I would say that's where we see that the most. And fawn, it is newer in the literature. So sometimes people haven't always heard of that. I would say it's like becoming a little more part of like it used to be fight, flight, or freeze. And now fawn is like a little bit more. I've definitely been talking about it like my whole career, but I think that it's, research gets done and then it's like slow for it to like really get into like the vernacular, but it's something that we have been talking about more, I would say, in the last like 7 to 10 years. So yeah, the hypoarousal is going to be feeling sluggish, depressed, feeling really exhausted, foggy, or zoned out. Sometimes it can just be feeling like disconnected. Sometimes people have that feeling of like watching themselves, like being outside of their own body. So this is kind of more of the same of just talking a little bit more about dissociation. And so this can be the victim is feeling spaced out and disconnected. Dissociation is when the brain like fragments itself to help protect from the trauma or from the trigger. And so the brain is kind of trying to like, what can we think about or do or shut down instead of fully experiencing this in our body. And so, when we're experiencing a trauma or we're experiencing a trigger or an activation, instead of like feeling all of it, our brain's like, okay, how can we disconnect from this a little bit? Because it's too much to feel it all at once. And so there are two types of dissociation. Derealization is a mental state where you feel detached from your surroundings. And so feeling like you don't belong or not feeling connected to the world, feeling like you're really just like living inside your head and your own body, and not able to connect with your surroundings or people. And then depersonalization is a state in which one's thoughts and feelings seem unreal or not to belong to oneself. And so this is really someone like has really a loss of identity. I've literally had clients before like that are like, I just don't feel like I'm real. and like not in like a state of psychosis way, but just like literally that's just like how disassociated they are. They've experienced so much trauma that it's hard for them to put together their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, their actions. And so it just feels like really detached from their own sense of self and like their own being. In extreme cases, survivors can develop dissociative identity disorder, which used to be referred to as multiple personality disorder. It is not as, I mean, it can be as dramatic as you see in the movies, but sometimes it's just not even that they do kind of like have memory loss when they go into their different um identities, but more often for trauma survivors, there's just like only one to three different parts of them. And it's because they have had to separate so much that that dissociation has just like really stuck. It's obviously like more complicated in the brain than that, but that feels like the easiest way to explain it is that they've spent so much time going into these different levels of dissociation to survive what they're going through that then their brain can kind of get them stuck in those different identities. And of course, like all of us dissociate to a certain degree. And so, like, daydreaming or having an imaginary friend as a kid is a form of dissociation. When you are just have had a bad day and you like zone out, like, that's dissociation. There are varying levels of it. And some of it is like healthy and does just kind of like help our brains and our bodies get through tough situations. But when someone gets more stuck in dissociation, where they're like having big pockets of time where they like are not present with people or dissociative identity disorder or shutting down, and when they like need to be doing something that obviously becomes more problematic. But all of these things are our brains working in like working for our survival, and so these aren't necessarily bad things. It's more when they go into those extreme roles that it becomes maladaptive and problematic. But it's hard and it takes a lot of work to work through some of these things because it is just our brain and our body helping us survive. So, along with dissociation, a little going more into what someone might experience when they're like actively experiencing like a sexual assault or some other trauma would be immobility responses. And so this is like different than the hypoarousal where the body is just kind of slowing down. This is like complete immobility. Like your brain is like just making the functions that you need to survive happen, and like nothing else is really going on. It's a severe form of the freeze response. So tonic immobility is like paralysis, cannot move or speak. So just very rigid, feeling numb, unfocused on what's going on. The body may be trembling or shaking, but it's just like that, cannot move, make noise. And then collapse immobility is like even more extreme, where also like your bodily functions are slowing down. Like your body is trying to slow down and stay alive, but have as little function as it can. And so the heart rate and the blood pressure get really low, could go in and out of consciousness. This one is less likely than tonic because it's just your body really, really slowing down all of those processes. And this one can take kind of longer. Both of these like take longer to come out of than those other nervous system responses. These type of all are freeze responses, but especially these type obviously can be a great source of guilt for a victim. It's really, we all want to think that if we were in a situation like this, that we would be able to like fight back or run away. And like, that's just literally not what your body is obviously it's always going to do. Your body's going to do whatever it feels like is the best way for you to survive a situation. And so I think it's really important to know this information and be able to communicate it clearly to clients that these are brain-based responses. The prefrontal cortex is not online and they are not really choosing this. This is just like their body being like, what can we do to just get through this situation? Okay. Trauma and memory. Okay. So as I mentioned before, during a traumatic incident, Information is only making it to the amygdala, and then the survival decisions are being made. This, of course, has huge impact on memory. Even typical memory is malleable. We all remember events differently, even if we were at the same place at the same time. That's because memory is reproductive, not recall. Our brains do not pull up and play a movie scene. It reconstructs the memory. So if your hippocampus and your prefrontal cortex are not involved during the traumatic event, that makes it harder to fully reproduce an event. Survivors may recall things out of order. There are two different types of memory, implicit and explicit. So these brain scans are of someone who, years after they experienced a trauma, they went under a study and had their brain scanned. And so the study was done where the survivor worked with someone on writing out their story the way that they remembered it. And then for the brain scan, someone else was like reading the story to them. And so basically this is showing that the person has their eyes closed, so their visual cortex should not show heightened activation, but they were reliving the memory so much that the brain looked like their eyes were open and they were taking in visual information and stimulus because that's how much they were remembering it. And then also the right limbic area was really lit up, which was like the emotions and the behavior. And then even though, wait, I explained it wrong. They do read it because the brain speech center shows decreased activation where like the visual cortex should be showing less activation because their eyes are closed, and then it's showing more activation and it's showing less activation in the Broca's area, even though they were speaking. So usually if your eyes are closed and you're talking, the Broca's area is going to be lit up and the visual cortex is not. And so this is showing that like our bodies and our brains are reliving things so much that our brain is kind of lighting up in the way that it probably was when they were experiencing it. They're really feeling like they're in the memory instead of it just being like reading a normal story. And so because multiple episodes can blur together from trauma as well, prompting non-suggestive questions can help with memory recall. So, the reason that it's so important to understand the brain and memory, especially as advocates, is because if you are walking through this process with someone, if you go meet someone at the hospital or they come into your agency and they have experienced a sexual assault or trafficking or domestic violence, whatever they've experienced, and then you're walking with them through this journey, especially if they are going through the court system because they are bringing charges against their perpetrator, like their memory becomes a big deal. Like their memories are important to evidence, to bringing justice for them to like cope and understand what's happened to them. And so us really understanding how memory works and being able to work with the clients to like help them reconstruct as much as they can, but helping them have grace for themselves when they literally can't remember, because if the hippocampus is not online, like that information, like it really actually just literally is not there. They have the emotions, they have some of the body sensations, but like some of those details are just not in there. And that can obviously be really hard for survivors, and it can be a lot of pressure sometimes when law enforcement, us, whoever is like really trying to help them to the best of our ability. But sometimes when those memories just literally aren't there, it can make it hard and it can bring on a lot of guilt. So we have two different types of memory, explicit and implicit. Explicit memory is semantic and episodic. Semantic memory is like general knowledge, so things we learn in school, facts that we know, like the states, the president, just facts, things about, I don't know, birds. But this is just our ability to hear information and remember it and be able to repeat it later. And then episodic memory is the ability to remember the order of events of something you experience. So when all parts of our brain are working and we are taking, like our brain is on the high road, we have that full vertical integration of like our body, our brainstem, and our brain is all connected, then we are fully online to be able to create episodic memories. You, like I said, you still might remember something differently than someone else that it was experienced the same event, but that's your ability to be like, I went to a party, I did this happened, these songs played, I talked with these people. I had fun. I felt included or I felt left out, but like remembering the story of something that happened. And so then implicit memory is emotional and procedural. So implicit memory is much less conscious than explicit memory. It's like even super tiny babies have implicit memory. So we're able to remember things, how we felt about things, even from a super young age. Um, and so procedural memory is the things you do often that you can almost do without thinking. And so, like your drive home, making your cup of coffee in the morning, even some things we do at work, once we've like done them so many times, it becomes procedural memory. And so we don't really have to think about every single detail every time we do it. And so that is a little that's more implicit because it's just so baked into our being and how we show up and do things every day. And then emotional memory is your body remembering the emotions and sensations you felt during an experience. So emotional memory is the primary thing that's happening during a traumatic experience. And that's like our brain and our body remembers how we feel, how scared we were, what we were feeling in our body. And unfortunately, our brains just like really don't let go of that. And that's how trauma responses happen, is that these emotional memories are baked in and there are triggers and activators for those, even if it's hard for us to know exactly what they are. That's a lot of big work that I do with clients. Is just that so much of their traumatic memory is emotional that they are getting triggered all the time and they don't know why or how. And so instead of always talking about the trauma, we're talking about like, okay, what happened that day before you went into that shutdown phase or before you lost it in an argument, like with your partner or your kid, like what was going on throughout the day that could have triggered this. And so really trying to like bring some knowledge more to what those triggers are, even when we can't remember, like, okay, this is exactly what happened to me. And so of course that's a trigger, but like this smell is really triggering for me, or when the weather changes, or when I drink something certain, or when someone like says something or makes me feel a certain way, like I am going out, like it's an out of body experience instead of just being like, oh, this person like cut me off and I got upset. It's like going to rage. And so figuring out how that works and then doing kind of some work on their nervous system to kind of help rewire that, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So I did just want to talk briefly about neuroplasticity since I talked about it at the beginning, but it is the ability of the brain to change its structure in response to experiences. And so neuroplasticity, this quote is, it's almost as if therapy is taking your 2-lane dirt road and building a 4-lane freeway alongside it. The old road stays, but you don't use it as much anymore. Therapy can be building a better alternative, a new default, and that takes repetition and time. And this quote specifically talks about therapy because of what it's from, but it's not just therapy, it's also advocacy groups, all the work that we're doing to provide safe new experiences for our clients. Neuroplasticity allows for those new roadways to be built. And so it's like our brain isn't creating new neurotransmitters and new parts of our brain, but our brain is able to create new pathways. And so when we have been in safe relationships, whether that's with a therapist or an advocate or just friends, we build those new roadways to be able to show up differently in our lives and in our relationships. And it doesn't always completely take away those old roads. They're still there and triggers can still happen, but creating those new roadways creates safety for clients and it helps their overall safety and functioning. So I also just want to touch a little bit on complex and developmental trauma. So individuals who have experienced multiple types of victimization or repeated abuse of the same type consistently over time Developmental trauma specifically is when the trauma has happened in the childhood years and it's cumulative over time. And then also, unfortunately, this kind of connects to like those survival mode on, especially when someone who has experienced complex or developmental trauma, they are more vulnerable to experiencing more trauma throughout their life until they are able to learn and grow and create those new pathways. And so it also can change their level of distress. So someone who has experienced like a young person who's experienced like a campus sexual assault and they've had no trauma in their history, or not no trauma, but they've had no big traumas like that in their history. There's obviously still going to be like a lot of distress, but sometimes it is easier for that person to go to therapy and heal and be able to like learn about their triggers and have a lower level of like ongoing distress in their life. Whereas someone who has experienced complex or developmental trauma, sometimes when they experience another trauma, that they're going to have like a really high level of distress because it's not just about that event, it's about all of this accumulation of events throughout their life. And so I just think this is an important thing to keep in mind as well, is that it's like different survivors are going to respond differently just because of different brain responses, but it's also something to keep in mind that someone that's experienced more trauma throughout their life might need a different level of care. Sometimes this can also be referred to as complex PTSD. Despite many efforts, complex PTSD, complex trauma, developmental trauma. None of it is outlined directly in the DSM. And so this isn't something that we can like diagnose people with for like insurance. But that's like more of a therapist thing. I just kind of think it's important because we hear about like these are the diagnosis. And like this is truly more what a lot of our clients are experiencing is complex and developmental trauma. And that's not like in the literature, but it is recognized by most people. So maybe next time, maybe DSM-6. Last Over the last like 5 years, I've started using polyvagal informed therapy in my practice. And I just think that the polyvagal theory is a really helpful way to kind of understand how our nervous system works. And so some of this is going to feel like repetitive from things we've already talked about, but it's just kind of another um, theory and organizing theme of talking about the nervous system that I find helpful. So I like to share it with people. And so the polyvagal theory, the organizing principles are neuroception. Neuroception is like that scanning that our brain is doing to make sense of the things that our body is feeling and seeing. And then co-regulation is our ability to regulate with another person. And so our nervous systems need other people's nervous systems to co-regulate. So when you have a baby or you have a baby in your life, when they are little, they're learning how to regulate by co-regulating off of us. And so when they're feeling upset, what do? We try to rock them and soothe them and help them calm down and part of that is the things we're doing, but it's also that if our system is calm, their system is able to co-regulate with us. And so when someone doesn't learn how to co-regulate, or they learn how to co-regulate, but when someone doesn't have safe people in their life, it's harder for them to, as they grow, learn how to regulate and self-soothe because they haven't co-regulated. And so anytime we're meeting with a client, whether you're doing therapy, advocacy, whatever you're doing, when you are showing up as a calm, safe, competent presence, that's providing co-regulation. And that in itself is healing for our clients, for them to feel safe and seen and heard is a co-regulating experience. And so the third thing is the autonomic hierarchy. And so it's basically kind of splits up that fight, flight, and freeze. And so the ventral vagal system is like that higher level thinking. Everything's online. We're able to feel safe and social. Our sympathetic nervous system is mobilization or fight or flight. So that's when we're like doing the things. And that's not always negative things. It's not always fight or flight. Sometimes it's just like doing our jobs, doing the dishes, problem solving. That's that sympathetic nervous system. And then dorsal vagal is that immobilization or shutdown. And so it can be dissociation, but it can also be depression, low mood, but just not having a lot of energy or motivation. And then this last slide just kind of shows how our body, this is kind of flipped. So the social engagement's on the bottom, fight or flight in the middle, of freeze at the top. And it has a lot more details of like what people might be feeling in their body. But the important thing to remember is that this we're not meant to be in ventral vagal all the time. This is just how our nervous system works. And so what happens is, you get up in the morning, you're feeling okay, but you spill your coffee. So you're going to kind of go into a sympathetic or even a freeze, but then you're going to be able to kind of regulate and move back into immobilized or into social engagement and kind of go throughout your day, driving to work. The person in front of you slams on their brakes, you slam on your brakes. And so then you're going in again into that kind of anxiety, panic, like you're knowing, like, okay, I need to do something to help this situation. But then you're able to like breathe through it and get back. And so that's kind of how our nervous systems are supposed to work. We're supposed to be able to move fluidly throughout the day as we experience things through social engagement, mobilization, and even immobilization. Like it's sometimes we just need a pause. Sometimes if you've experienced trauma, unhealthy relationships, then it you can get stuck in these different areas. So you might get stuck in fight or flight where you're always just like thinking about what you need to do to survive, feeling frustration, feeling anger. Your body, it's really hard on your body, but you're feeling like high levels of cortisol, struggling all the time. And so when you're stuck and you always feel like you're either in that fight or flight or that freeze and you're never in social engagement, like that's not helpful or healthy long term. And so this is why I feel like this polyvagal theory is helpful too, because it's just kind of showing like this is how those long-term impacts of trauma is like the trauma is impacting the nervous system. Our bodies and our minds are remembering what we've experienced, and it's doing its best to make sense of things. And sometimes that leads to being stuck in feeling like you're in danger or shut down, even when you're not actively experiencing something. I'll go ahead and go to this last slide too. This is just some of my references and things. We'll also talk about a polyvagal. It'll come up again when we talk about vicarious trauma and burnout and self-care on Thursday. So I look forward to being back with you guys then.